Sweet. All right, it's 10:30. So Molly, you can go ahead and introduce yourself. I figured out how to stream us on Facebook Live as well. So if anybody's uncomfortable with that, please just turn off your cameras. But yeah, this is really exciting. Thank you so much for joining us today, and just go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Abby. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see everybody in our isolated worlds. It's so great to have some level of communication. I want to first start off by saying thanks to the Asheville Museum of Science for organizing this series. I've actually been watching several of the series up to this point, and it's been a learning experience for me. I've learned about oyster reefs, and I've learned about the invasion of woolly adelgids. I've learned about two giant rat snakes named Slip and Slide, and all kinds of different things. So I'd also like to acknowledge Abby, because she has organized this entire event and has really done a phenomenal job bringing in a diverse array of speakers. And so with that, let me share my screen so that I can begin. Maybe, if I can. You would think after this long with Zoom, I would be much more comfortable, but I am not. I'm still a novice.
Got it.
Okay, let me go into start from the very beginning.
And please, everyone, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, just feel free to type it right into the chat box to everyone, and Molly will just check it every once in a while and try and answer them as best as she can. So don't be shy.
I will. Abby, is there a way I can see the chat?
You should be able to, but if you can't, I can just send you directly the questions.
Awesome, that would be great. Thank you very much. Okay, so my name is Molly Albecker. I have a degree called a PhD, which means I spent much of my life doing research. And I spent much of that time doing research on frogs, and I'm going to share with you today some of the things that I have learned in my research and through other people's research about frogs. So my plan for today is just to go over some froggy basics. So we're going to learn all about the different kinds of frogs, the different aspects of what frogs are. And then we're going to talk about different research that's been done on frogs, because you may not actually know how much we know about humans based on work that was done with frogs. So we're going to cover some of that, and then I'll cover the research that I've been doing and what I'm learning from frogs. So jumping right in, what are frogs? Well, frogs and toads are what we would call an amphibian. Amphibian is a level of classification that is like we would call something a bird or a mammal or a reptile. We also call frogs and toads amphibians. These are generally characterized as being cold-blooded or ectothermic. They are vertebrate animals, which means they have a backbone, and they're characterized by having a complex life cycle. I'm going to go into what a complex life cycle is in a moment, but it might be interesting to know other kinds of amphibians. So in addition to frogs and toads, there are salamanders, which are a type of amphibian. There are newts, which are a type of amphibian. There's an animal called a caecilian, which is a type of amphibian. But for the most part, I'm going to be focusing on frogs and toads. And I have here a picture of a salamander up in the top right. That is a red-backed salamander. They're common in Virginia and North Carolina. And the way you can find those is if you go out into the woods around your house and you find logs that are on the ground. If you roll those logs over, sometimes you'll find one sitting underneath that log. So you can actually find these near where you live. I do recommend, if you are outside looking for salamanders, that you go with clean hands and you're very, very gentle if you touch it. And whenever you roll a log over, that you roll it back so that you restore the home of that salamander. All right, so what is a complex life cycle? Well, let me start by talking about a simple life cycle. So if you think about mammals like humans or elephants, when humans and elephants have babies, the babies look like adult humans and elephants to some extent. In other words, you know that when there's a baby elephant, that they look like an elephant. You can tell it's an elephant. So that's because where you start off and then you continue through your whole life, essentially looking like the same thing. You eat, for the most part, the same thing through your whole life. Well, complex life cycles are different. And this is where through the life of the animal, you have these very distinct stages that often look completely different. So they often occupy different habitats. So sometimes you'll live completely in water and then you'll move completely to land. You often eat different things. For example, tadpoles are herbivores. They eat plankton. We're going to cover this more later. But adults that live on land are omnivorous and typically carnivorous, so they eat insects. And so it's a complete different change in their resource use and their niche use. So I'm going to go more into that in a little bit. But first, let's talk about the difference between frogs and toads. Some people think these things are very different. Well, in fact, toads are just a form of frog. So toads are a type of frog. Typically, what we're talking about on the East Coast of the United States are species that are in the Bufonidae family. They used to be called the Bufo genus, but now they've been renamed to the Anaxyrus genus. And typically, these are your your American toad, your southern toad, and your Fowler's toad, which are the three species that are commonly found on the East Coast, down in Asheville and also up in Virginia. But there are some differences. So they're not completely the same. We do know that the toads that we often see kind of walking around our houses are very different from frogs. So here I have on the right two pictures. The top one is a toad, the bottom one is a frog. And what we see are some of these differences. So toads typically have this drier, bumpier skin. Toads have whereas frogs typically have a moist, more, it might sound a little gross, but they often have a mucus covering on their skin. Toads have these giant things called parotid glands. And if you can see my mouse, I'm kind of outlining the parotid gland on this toad. And if you look very closely, you can see all these little dark spots. Well, those are little openings that the toad will secrete a toxin called a bufotoxin. Now, the point of that toxin is to essentially produce a very bad tasting chemical that helps get them away from predators. So a common predator of toads are snakes, actually. And so when snakes approach these toads, they will secrete, they'll squeeze those parotid glands and secrete out this bufotoxin that sends the signal to this snake that I'm not edible. Unfortunately for toads, some of these snakes have actually figured out how to eat the frogs and to pellet the toxins. And I'm getting questions from Abby as we go. So do all toads do that? To the Bufo genus, they do. They vary in their level of toxicity. So oftentimes you don't want to let your dogs and your pets sniff around toads because it could make them very sick, but typically it won't. I mean, we're not going to be licking toads anyway, but it's not going to cause a bunch of problems for humans. And Matt Miller, what makes jobs jump so fast? I will tell you in just a moment, because that's my next point. So toads have these very short legs, so they kind of walk and do these small little hops. Frogs have these extremely long legs, so you can see where I'm outlining here where their legs go, and they also have this extremely long hip girdle. So whereas our hips are kind of narrow and almost look like a little box, theirs take up almost half their body, half their, if you look at their, like where their stomach is, it's often their entire hip girdle. So that gives them a lot of flexibility, and that's how they can leap so far. Toads have the Bufo genus, or excuse me, Anaxyrus. That's a problem with being in this for so long, is you learn the species name one way and then they change it and you have to go back, you have to learn the new way. So if I say Bufo, I mean Anaxyrus, but they have this ridge over their eyes, whereas frogs do not have a ridge over their eyes. And in general, we do notice that frogs tend to be more aquatic. So if you're out looking for frogs, oftentimes you'll find them more around lakes, around ponds, around wetlands, whereas toads, you often find them not super close to water, so in your garden or in your backyard. An important point here, though, is that the eggs and the tadpoles of frogs and toads are all fully aquatic. So toads do have to go to a pond or a wetland to reproduce. And in fact, if you are ever looking around a pond or wetland and you see some eggs that you think look like a frog egg, you can kind of tell what species or what genus is around based on what those egg clumps look like. So here we have toad eggs. So toads will lay eggs in single, essentially a bead of eggs, a single bead of eggs that kind of curl up on themselves like a little curlicue. And they're very distinct from what a frog egg clump looks like. So here we have a frog egg clump, which is essentially just a big gloopy clump of eggs. And then you might also be thinking, well, how do I identify frogs in the wild? Toads in the wild, frogs are pretty distinct. I think they're more distinct than toads are. Toads are always very difficult to tell apart. I will answer this in just the question I just received about clutches of eggs in just 1 second. So the one way to tell toads apart is by looking at the top of their heads. They have something called a cranial crest, which is different across the different species. So this is Fowler's toad, where you see this big form here is the parotid gland, where you see the crest actually touches the parotid gland. This is the American toad, where you see separation between the crest and the parotid gland, and then the southern toad, or Bufo terrestris, Anaxyrus terrestris, have these kind of bulbous forms on there. So they can be told apart. It's just a little bit trickier. The question was, how many offspring usually survive in one clutch of eggs? That's a very good question. And the answer is it depends. It depends because sometimes predators will eat the eggs, which obviously reduces the number that hatch. And other times, if the water doesn't have enough oxygen in it, it's kind of surprising, but eggs do need oxygen. So if they don't have enough oxygen, they won't hatch. And then the final thing is if there's anything in the water that could infect the eggs, so like molds or funguses can actually cause those eggs not to hatch. Otherwise, usually probably 90 to 95% hatch, assuming fertilization. Are there different predators for frogs throughout their complex life cycle? That's a fantastic question, and I'm going to answer that in just a moment if you hang on. So first, I want to talk about where frogs came in the geologic time period. So if we go from modern day, which is the top of this drawing, all the way back down to when Earth was first formed, and then we see the different time periods. So the Holocene, which is the one we exist in now, and then we go down deeper, 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 going further, further back in time. We go to the Jurassic time period and Triassic, which you may know is when the dinosaurs existed. And then you keep going further down to this Permian, and that's when we see frogs appearing in the fossil record. And by frogs, I mean modern frogs. So things that can be actually identified as a frog in their modern form. And so that's when we see frogs appear, which is really interesting, I think, because that means that not only are frogs older than dinosaurs, but they actually outlasted the dinosaurs. So the next time you think dinosaurs are super, super tough, frogs are tougher. I'm not biased. Now, how does each stage of the life cycle work? Now, the question about predation, I'm going to answer as I go. But the answer is yes, there are different predators for each phase of the complex life cycle. Are there any poisonous frogs in North Carolina? The toads do excrete a slight toxin, which can make your dog sick, but again, probably won't hurt a human. But in general, I'm assuming you're asking more about poison frogs, and the answer is no, those don't exist. And North Carolina, outside of people's hobby tanks. So later on in the show, I actually have a frog to show you, and I will tell you a little bit about how to keep a frog in a tank. So hang on for that. And how did the frogs survive when the dinosaurs died out? I have no idea. I'm assuming because they're smaller, they were able to hide out and kind of take up little, like hide out in little nooks wherever they could and hibernate. But I'm actually not sure about that one. All right, so thanks, Abby, for texting all these. Starting with the egg stage. Now, parents listening, I'm going to keep this very superficial for you, but I do want to talk about how eggs are made. So what happens with frogs is oftentimes in the summer, you will have a rain event which will fill in all these ponds with water. And then all the male frogs will go to these areas with fresh water. They will climb up on the grasses around the pond and they'll start calling. And that call is dependent on what species they are. So they all make different calls. And what that call is doing is saying, I'm over here, I'm over here, I'm over here. And they're all trying to get the attention of a female. Now those females will also be coming to that pond. And those females will hear those males and they will go to him up on the vegetation. That male, as you can see here, will climb on her back, almost like a little piggyback. And that's a thing that scientists call amplexus. So those are when the frogs are in amplexus. She will actually carry him down and to the pond. And that's where she will begin to lay her eggs and the male will fertilize them. And so this is an external process. And as she lays her eggs, they come out in this one by one in a strand. You can see here the eggs being laid. And as they come out, they're fertilized. Now, you may be thinking, that doesn't look like the big gloopy mess that I saw earlier. That's correct. That's because they have, when they come out, the female covers them with a very thin coat of this, what's called a glycoprotein matrix, or like a small jelly matrix. And when it hits the water, it actually soaks up the water like a sponge and expands around that egg. So another interesting thing with frog eggs is you can see with these eggs here, I really like this picture because it shows it so nicely. These frog eggs, this is not a shell. This is actually the little embryo coming out. And they have this white and black side. So the white side is what's called the vegetal pole. The dark side is called the animal pole. And what actually will happen is when those eggs are fertilized, they will orient so that the dark side is up, so it's facing the sky, and the white side is down. And what that eventually turns into is the dark side is what becomes the tadpole, and the bottom, the white side, is actually what becomes the yolk. And that's what the growing and developing embryo feeds on as it develops into a young hatchling tadpole. So I really like this picture because it shows it really nicely. So, and then this picture on the left here shows what those eggs will eventually become. And so this is pretty typical of all vertebrate development. So believe it or not, we all looked like this at some point in our mothers. As we developed, we're so small that we developed what's called a neural crest. And this eventually becomes the backbone and the head and tail. So that's pretty neat. All right, so where are the eggshells? Well, I told you that they swell up and have this jelly coat. But unlike things like reptiles or birds, they don't have a hard shell on the outside. That's actually something that comes later in the animal kingdom. So frogs don't have a hard eggshell. All right, so is there any parental care at this stage? For the vast majority, no. Oftentimes the females will lay her eggs and then they're done. They're off to find breakfast somewhere else. Sometimes the females are able to choose where she lays her eggs. So there is some amount of control. So if a female is presented with two ponds where one has a fish predator in it and one doesn't, research has shown that she will choose the one that doesn't have a fish in it. But beyond that, often they would just lay their eggs and off they go, never to return. However, there are some species down in South America, specifically glass frogs, which is what this picture is down at the bottom, where these glass frogs will lay eggs on leaves, which is already different because usually eggs are laid in water. And then the male will sit and guard, and he will guard those eggs against predators and other animals that might eat. So to answer one of the questions earlier about different predators, oftentimes during the egg stage, they'll have wasps that eat the nests, eat the eggs. Snakes will eat the eggs. When you're in the water, everything eats the eggs. I mean, eggs are very nutritious in nature. So unfortunately, they're consumed quite frequently. Okay, how fast are they born? Right, so how fast does this stage last? Now, something you'll notice is that frogs, this period, so egg and tadpole stages happen in one summer. So it has to happen pretty quickly to fit it into one summer. And so usually the eggs will stay eggs for about a week at the most. Usually they'll hatch out in 2 to 3 days. Will frogs mate with more than one male female per season? Yes, they will. Oftentimes the males are more likely to mate because it's less, it takes a lot of energy to make a bunch of eggs, which is what the females have to do. So sometimes they are able to make 2 or 3 egg clutches, but we do know that they at least do it once. But odds are multiple times through the season. Okay, great questions, everybody. All right, after they hatch, they become tadpoles. Now, tadpoles are the larval stage. So this is where they're in water. Often, most tadpoles are in water, the vast, vast majority. And they can't leave water. So they're just like fish. They actually breathe like fish, which I'll get to that in a minute. They eat, while they're tadpoles, they often eat phytoplankton and algae. So if you look at this horrifying photograph on the right here of a tadpole that has been like essentially a frontal picture of a tadpole face, this right here is the mouth. And these mouths are essentially beaks that are made out of keratin. So that is like the same stuff, hard stuff that your fingernails are made out of. And they use that to scrape away algae from leaves and from the branches that they live around. So they eat mostly algae and plants. There are some exceptions, of course, there's always an exception. There are some tadpoles that are actually carnivorous and they'll eat other tadpoles, but those are pretty rare in nature. How do they breathe? Well, how do fish breathe? Fish breathe through gills. So tadpoles actually have gills as well. So when they're very, very young, the gills are outside of their head, but then they actually develop gills inside their head, like right around their neck, kind of like where fish gills are. And they will breathe using oxygen diffusion through those gills. What is the point of being a tadpole? Well, if you're a tadpole, the point is to survive to become an adult. And more important, at the same time, you're trying to eat as much as you can to grow as big as you can, as fast as you can. Because, like somebody asked, there are predators in these ponds, and these tadpoles are, by and large, defenseless. So they can do things like hide or swim away real fast, but they don't have any sort of defenses. Toads, again, are known to produce a small toxin that makes them taste bad, but it often doesn't stop predators from consuming them. So from the tadpole's point of view, they want to get as big as they can, as fast as they can, so they can get out of there. However, if we think about it more on a broad scale, like if we're thinking about the whole ecosystem, the point of tadpoles is that they control algae. So if you don't want to have a pond that's overrun with algae, they do help control algae. They also provide food for a large variety of animals. So birds will eat them, other invertebrates will eat them. They pretty much subsidize an entire food web level. So that's the broader point of being a tadpole. Is there parental care? Still, most often, no. Most of the adults are gone. They're doing their adult thing, which is just eating. And they're off, you know, hanging out. There is an exception. There's a few exceptions, actually. There's one species of poison frog that lives in Peru called Renidomia imitator. And this frog will actually wait for his babies to hatch. He only has a very few number of babies. And then the dad actually will carry those offspring to their little pool, which is where he kind of takes care of them as they grow and develop. And it's really, really interesting because A, that's super rare for frogs to have parental involvement, and B, that it's the dad that's doing it. So yay, dads, for taking care of your young. And I will also say that the mother is not just off hanging out, you know, she is involved as well. The dad will call to the mom and she will come and lay an unfertilized egg for her offspring to eat. So kind of like having eggs for breakfast. But again, that's the exception. Most of the time, they're just on their own. And again, how long does this stage last? It will last anywhere from the shortest larval period I know of are spadefoot toads, which are about 8 days, which is extremely fast. And the longest are some of the really big frogs, like bullfrogs and green frogs, which can actually survive over a winter. Most, I would say, metamorphose within 2 to 3 months and do it within one summer. All right, so what is metamorphosis? Metamorphosis is when these tadpoles turn into adult frogs. And this is a very interesting time because everything about their body changes. I mean, just imagine going through some of these changes. It's just incredible what happens. And so their habitat, they're going from water to land. Oftentimes they will emerge out of the water, so they'll climb out onto some structure. And for the question that asked, how do we keep frogs and toads? If you are raising tadpoles, which I'm going to mention later, at this point, you always want to make sure you're giving some opportunity for those tadpoles to climb out. So if that's a floating piece of styrofoam or a branch that is kind of tucked down as a ramp, you want to make sure they can get out. And the reason is because they lose their gills and start to become air breathers. I got the question, how are toad tadpoles different from frog tadpoles? Toad tadpoles, this is a very subtle difference. They tend to be like more ball shaped and have smaller tails, whereas frogs tend to be like more oval. Toads do have some degree of toxicity in their skin as tadpoles as well. Again, it won't hurt humans, or it's not a very high level of toxicity, but it is there, and it's there to discourage predators. We missed who eats the poisonous frog eggs for breakfast. Still everything. So crayfish, sometimes even adult frogs will eat them. Dragonfly larvae, which also live in water. Fish love them. They'll still eat them. It's unfortunately not enough, I think, toxicity to discourage the predation. So all kinds of things eat them. So what triggers this transformation to metamorphose? Usually it's a combination of things outside of the frog and inside of the frog. So things that happen outside. Well, as summer progresses, what happens to all those ponds? Well, they start drying down and the water goes down and uh-oh, their house is getting smaller. So that kind of helps trigger this it's time to go response. And what that'll do is trigger changes in the frog's body, which are all hormones. So very similar to humans that are going through changing from children to adult. We have a lot of hormones in that time that trigger all those changes. Very similar with a frog. So in the hypothalamus, which is a structure in the brain, releases this corticoid releasing hormone, which turns on the pituitary, which is another structure in the brain, which then turns on this hormone called thyroxine. And it's thyroxine that really starts the whole process of remodeling. Now, what gets remodeled? What kind of changes occur? So many. So they will have grown back legs, but they will also grow front legs. They will change their insides. So in water, they will produce, like you and I go to the bathroom, they actually will change the structure of how they go to the bathroom, which is, I think, very interesting. And they even change the way they breathe. So they no longer breathe through gills, they breathe air. And then they also change the way they eat. Whoops. So instead of having that keratinized beak that I showed you before, their whole mouth will reform into a mouth where they actually have small, tiny little teeth. Frogs do, toads don't, where they'll eat prey. And so how are they supporting all the energetic demands during this time? Because they can't eat. Their mouths are literally under construction. So what do? Well, that tail that they had during their larval period, they'll essentially, as they break the proteins and the fats that they store in that tail down, that's what they'll use to sustain their energy as they go through this process. It's another very quick process. So usually happens, they'll usually grow their legs over an extended period of time, but then once the legs pop out, it's pretty quick and they start to really, within a week at the latest, probably 1 or 2 days. That is so cool, Abby. All right, and then they become adults. So most of the time, the frogs we know of as adults are terrestrial, or they live on land. Some are aquatic, so some do stay in the water, but for the most part, they hop onto land and they will hang out there. And what do they eat while they're adults? Typically anything smaller than their mouth. So that's usually small invertebrates like crickets, small grasshoppers, earthworms, roly-polies, that sort of thing. Now, while I'm talking about this, I actually want to bring out a little friend named Greenie. Now, we went out and we found this frog. Let me make sure I can. Uh-oh. Run away, frog! Got him. All right. So I want to introduce you to Greenie here. Greenie is a green frog. So they're known by the name Lithobates clamitans or clamitans. They are in North Carolina and they get all the way up the East Coast. So they are in Virginia and all the way up and down. This one's a pretty small one. So this one is probably a year or so, maybe 2 years old. But this is, they get much, much larger than this. And so I wanted to bring this out before I talked about the next question, because how do they breathe? Adult frogs do have lungs, so they can, if you see here, you see how he's, I don't know if it's a boy, I'm just gonna say he. You see how they're pumping? What he's doing is actually breathing air, but they don't breathe like we do. So we can breathe without thinking about it because our bodies just do it naturally. This frog actually has to think about breathing. So he's pumping air actively into his lungs. The other way that they breathe is actually through their skin. So I think I mentioned that their skin is very moist and very thin. So they don't have any coverings like reptiles do, which is like scales or feathers, obviously. And so they can actually diffuse oxygen through their skin. And the same with how they drink. They don't drink through their, I don't think they drink through their mouth. They actually just absorb it through their skin. So when they go and they sit in water, sometimes they're actually drinking. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. They're very slippery, by the way. So a good way to hold frogs while we're talking about it is to support their body and hold one leg. So they're pretty flexible with their legs. And so this is a pretty safe way for them to be comfortable and held, but they can still jump because they're so slippery, as you've seen, and they can still get out. And they're actually surprisingly strong. So how do they drink? I want to show you, let's see if you can see through my fingers.
Molly, could you actually unshare your screen just to show the froggy?
Oh, can you
just
not?
the greenie. Well, we can see him a little bit, but just in your tiny one.
Do I have to make it bigger? I'm one-handed here.
If you can figure out how to unshare the screen just for like momentarily, that's fine. But if not, it's okay.
Abby, I told you I don't know how to do Zoom. Okay, here we go. So if you look here, where between my fingers, you have sort of the area, and that's where they go to the bathroom, but it's also an area that's called the pelvic patch. So it's an area of skin that's especially porous. And so when they sit down in water, they will actually be absorbing water through that little pelvic patch area. So that's how frogs drink. Now, I'm just going to keep continuously answering this question about how you keep frogs. It's very important that as you're keeping frogs that you keep water very close by. Not necessarily, unless they're aquatic, you don't want to just put them in water and let them swim, because frogs can actually drown if they don't have support. But if you get a habitat and sort of turn it on an angle so that one half has a little puddle of water and the other half is covered with like branches or various things like that, so they have little substrate, you can keep frogs safely. So we have this guy here. Now this is a green frog. They are often confused for bullfrogs. The difference being, if you can see this ridge along its side, let me see, very small, but there, you can kind of see that ridge line along its side. That is what distinguishes it from a bullfrog. So bullfrogs are just smooth, their whole back is smooth. Whereas these guys have a little ridge, and they also have a different call. And I'm actually going to play you the call. So I think that they sound like a, maybe I'm not going to.
And if it doesn't work, we can always attach it to the video later.
Okay, essentially it sounds like what I would call a loose banjo string. So they sound like a plum, plum, plum. And if you're curious, absolutely, all herpetologists love to make the sounds of their animals horribly. And so let me go to the bottom here. All right, and I'll play it. So that's the call of the green frog. And this is in contrast to the bullfrog, which is often like a home, home, home. I know, we all do it. Okay, so that's the green frog. I'm going to put this guy away. Hold on, we have another escape attempt.
Frog catcher, everybody.
And I just want to share with you, this was very temporary. We only kept this frog for a couple of days because we're going to set it back free where we collected it. But we kept it in a little Tupperware, you can see, and I kept it angled so that the bottom was filled with water, and I have leaves in here so that it can feel natural, like it's at home. And of course, very important to let air in. And also something that I've been doing is I would go out every day and dig up some earthworms and look for roly-polies and little insects, and I would feed it invertebrates every day. So that's an important part of frog care. All right, so that's frog life. That's each of the stages of the life cycle. Okay, how many, we want Greenie. How many types of frogs are there? Many, 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 many. There are, I believe at last count, 7,000 species that are currently known. I would be very hard pressed to guess how many of those are in the US. But I would, in North Carolina, and at least Eastern North Carolina, there are at least 30 species that you can find. When do their tongues grow? So frogs do have a sticky tongue that they will use to catch their prey. They don't have like the sort of cartoony, if you think about a cartoon where they throw their tongue way out, they don't do that. They can't shoot it super far, but they can get it out a little bit. And that's in the adult phase when they use a tongue like that. And it is sticky, and they'll use it to capture their prey and bring it into their mouth. So the next part is all about what we have learned about humans from frogs. So you may be thinking, what do I have in common with a frog? Well, more than you think. So frogs make very good research subjects. They're generally easy to keep alive. They're generally easy to work with when they're not jumping all over the place, as we just saw. And they go all the way back to the 1700s. So back in the 1790s, there was a scientist called Luigi Galvani. He lived in Europe. And what he did is, you can see from this picture, is rigged up this very Frankenstein-looking getup where he connected a frog that had died to wires. And then he waited for a storm. And as you may guess, the electricity from that storm actually caused a frog that should not be moving to move. So this is how they figured out that electricity is actually what causes muscles to contract. And you know, this may seem like knowledge, well, we never knew that. It's always fun to think about these things that seem so basic to our understanding. Well, they didn't know that back then. They didn't know how muscles worked. And so this was the first time that they figured out that muscles are controlled by electricity, and that it originates in the spine. So those nerve impulses start in your brain, travel down your spine, and then go out to your limbs. And then in the 1920s, a very similar line of research actually identified acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter that is relaying nerve impulses, and they used frog legs for that, which is pretty interesting. What else have we learned? Well, so much. As you recall, I told you that frogs don't have hard white shells, so you can see through them with your own naked eye. That means you can essentially study embryonic development very easily. If you didn't have a microscope, you could see how things were developing and understand embryology. You can also experiment with these frogs. So because they're not protected by a hard shell, you can actually manipulate those embryos and see what happens. Interestingly, some of us are old enough to recall when Dolly the sheep was cloned back in 1996, way back when. So there was a sheep that was cloned, and it was heralded as this huge advancement for science, and it was. But what you may not know is the technology that led to the sheep being cloned was actually refined and figured out in frogs. So frogs were cloned before the sheep. Skin peptides. So on their skin, I have talked about toads a little bit, how toads can produce a toxin. Well, other frogs can produce compounds as well on their skin. So they will produce mucus that helps them stay moist. It essentially keeps the water from evaporating out of their bodies. But they will also produce peptides out of granular glands in their skin. And the most famous example of this, of course, is the poison frog, where out of those granular glands, they produce a toxin that they acquire through their diet. And native tribes in Colombia were known to take those toxins and apply them to their blow darts to add a little punch and zing to those darts. So that's a very famous example. But what you may not know is that they're not just toxic. They actually have antimicrobial properties. They have antifungal properties. And this means that the peptides on their skin help protect frogs from being infected, which is really neat. It's neat for the frogs, but it's also neat because humans are now studying those compounds to figure out if we can take those that structure and apply it to ourselves and come up with new ways of protecting ourselves against infection, which, as everybody I'm sure knows, is important. Very, very important. Another thing that skin peptides will do is, I've totally forgotten. I'll remember later. But they're really, really cool. Another thing that we know about frogs is a lot of basic physiology has been discovered using frogs. So obviously we all know that frogs are often dissected. This is because, or dissected in like your high school biology courses or your college biology courses. This is because their anatomy is not too far different from humans, and it's a good model to understand how the body is structured and how everything looks inside. For example, in the 1850s, a guy by the name of Stanius opened up a frog and used a frog heart to identify that the ventricle, which is the bigger chamber of the frog's heart, they have a 3-chambered heart, the ventricle and the atria, which sit on top, beat separately. And so they figured out that, oh, this is how hearts in humans work. So it was through frogs that they figured that out. And then finally, one of the more interesting things is that frogs were actually used as pregnancy tests once upon a time in the 1930s. There's a species called the African clawed frog, or the Xenopus laevis, which are sort of the lab rat of the frog world. And what these frogs will do is, if they are exposed to HCG, the females will lay eggs. So what they would do is they would take products from a woman, inject it under the skin of a frog, and then if she laid eggs, congratulations, you're pregnant. Thankfully, we don't do that anymore. Thankfully, we don't no longer rely on frogs for that process, but it's interesting that frogs were used for this. It was called the Hogbin test. All right, so that's what we as humanity have learned from frogs. Just a few things, of course, there's much, much more. But I want to share with you, in the time we have left, what I'm learning from frogs. So my research, the stuff that I spent the last several years of my life doing, is based around this problem of environmental change. So we know that environments are changing extremely quickly, much faster than they have ever before that we know of. And so unfortunately, when these environments change, many species can't change as fast, and they are therefore threatened with extinction. And these changes can come from all different kinds of areas. So they can come from climate change, which is the one I'm interested in. They can come from species invasions, which one of the speakers previously spoke about woolly adelgids and how they're causing extinctions with the hemlock in eastern forests. And unfortunately, this is a big problem, and we want to stop this because we care about animals and we care about diversity. If you look at this plot from the IUCN a year ago, they showed that about 1 in 4 species right now is threatened with extinction. And so amphibians are actually 40% of all amphibians are threatened with extinction right now, which is really terrible if you love amphibians like I do. And so what does this mean? I'm going to show you a graph, but I'm going to walk you through it. Okay, so here we have a number of animals. So right up here we have, say, a pond with a bunch of frogs around it. So starting off, we have a bunch of frogs. And then something about that pond changes. Let's say it becomes polluted and becomes very different from what it was before. Well, those frogs that can't handle the pollution start to die off. And so the population starts to go down, go down, go down. Now, if it goes down far enough, that species will go extinct, unfortunately. However, there is a point where with intervention, sometimes with human intervention, we can recover those populations and save them from going extinct. So this is where human interventions come in. This is where a lot of conservation work is working to sort of stop this decline and help get that species to recovery. But the other thing that can rescue a species from going extinct is if they evolve. So evolution is where those species change their genetic code so that they can survive and ultimately reproduce. And they would do this on their own without human intervention. So I'm trying to understand why some species that are headed down this path of extinction, some can get rescued. And I want to know why. And if we can figure out why some can evolve, maybe we can use that to help save all kinds of animals. And plants. Plants can come too, if they must. So I do this using frogs. My specific study species is the green tree frog. So this is not the same one that I showed you earlier. This is a tree frog. Hyla cinerea. They look like this guy here. They're bright green with usually a stripe down the side. And they live in the southeastern United States. So unfortunately, they don't quite make it over to Asheville because they like to hug the coast, but they do get all the way up into Maryland, all the way down to Florida and over to Texas. And they live in these freshwater habitats. Now, a big problem along the coast of North Carolina, which is where I did this research, is saltwater intrusion. And this is basically where you have freshwater ponds that are near the coast or near the ocean. And due to various things happening like erosion, like storm surges, like sea level rise, that salt water starts to move further inland and it contaminates those freshwater ponds and gets them salty. If you're a freshwater organism and something gets very salty, it's not going to go very well for you. Like humans, you may not think of it this way, but humans are freshwater animals. We can drink fresh water. We cannot drink salt water. If we drink salt water, eventually it will kill us. We can't survive on it. So unfortunately, when we put frogs in salt water, they should not exist or they should not survive because they can't tolerate it. And we're already seeing where freshwater organisms are dying out on the coast of North Carolina, and it's actually becoming a big problem out in that area. But, and while I'm talking, I want you to look at this. This is a little patch of Spartina that is on the Outer Banks that a picture I took while I was out collecting one night. And I want you to look through this grass and see how many frogs you can find while I'm talking. So see how many you can find in this small, small little patch of grass. Now, when I was out collecting this night, it was 13 parts per thousand, which is the ocean. If you've ever tasted the ocean, which if you have, it tastes so salty and it's really gross. That's about 35 parts per thousand. So 13 is about a third the saltiness of the ocean. And so I was out one night and out collecting, and usually what that means is that I'll go out and I'll listen for the frogs, and if I can hear them out there, I'll follow my ears all the way out and look for them physically. And on this night, I found 8 frogs. Who found 8? Now this is just a small little patch of grass, and that should show you how dense these frogs are packed. And that means this population is huge. So these frogs that should not exist in this salty water do. So that is really where my research began. I ran several experiments over the following years, and I did find that, in fact, these frogs have evolved to survive in a stressful or salty environment. And so the question is then, how? How are they doing this? How are they able to live in this very stressful environment? And so I think even though as humans, we often want one easy answer and one quick solution to a big problem, unfortunately, there's not, because they're actually doing many, many different things differently that help control or that help them to survive. Is that how poison dart frogs got their label? Yes, that is how they got their label. Are there frogs resistant to chytrid? That's a fungal infection, right? You are absolutely right. That is a fungus. Chytrid infection is one of the leading causes of frog extinction right now. So chytrid is from a fungus called Batrachochytrium dendropatitis, or BD. It causes chytridiomycosis, which is where the fungus will actually get into the skin and into those keratinized structures around the body, and it will plug them, which means that, you know, like the frogs breathe through their skin. Well, if that's blocked, they can't breathe and they can't get water. So it'll actually kill them kind of in a horrific way. There are frogs that are resistant to chytrid. It's a very complex area of research right now. The fungus itself thrives in running water, and in the United States, most frogs actually reproduce in stagnant water. So there's differences in habitat and exposure. There's also differences according to species. Some species can have the chytrid fungus and just be fine. Like I know that bullfrogs are carriers of the chytrid fungus, and unfortunately, well, fortunately, they're fine. They can just carry it and not be affected by it, but they are invasive in other areas and have been known to transmit the fungus to other more sensitive species. So good question. Chytrid is a big thing. And there are, kind of similar to what I'm saying, there are some species that are showing evolution in response to it. So they are evolving and trying and gaining resistance that way. Are you the first one to discover that these frogs evolved to be able to live in salt water? The answer there is kinda. There were people in the 50s that found frogs on the coast and wrote sort of these older papers that are like, this is weird, but they didn't have a way to really measure salinity super accurately. So we don't really have good records of how saline that water was. So in North America, the salinity that I found them in is the highest salinity that these frogs have been found in. However, and I will say a very important however, there actually is a species out in Asia called the crab-eating frog. And as you might have guessed by their name, the crab-eating frog means they live in saltwater. So this is not the only frog known to do this. This is the first example of this in the US. And I would actually attribute that not necessarily to me, but just to the fact that we all thought, scientists in general were like, no, frogs are freshwater organisms. Therefore, they are not going to live in these habitats, so don't look there for them. So it could be just because nobody was looking before. So kinda is the big answer there. Going back to the presentation, where how are these frogs living in salt water? Well, they have many changes. So one way that they've changed is by changing their behavior. So I told you back when we were talking about frog eggs and parental care that sometimes the mothers will lay eggs, in habitats that are fishless or the best for their offspring. Well, in fact, this is kind of counterintuitive because what I found is that these mothers, these coastal frog mothers, don't avoid salt water. So you would think if you're a good mom, you would kind of pick the freshwater, wouldn't you? Well, she's not. And so I think the line of logic there is that because she's laying eggs in salt water, she's actually letting that water trigger physiological changes, so changes inside the body of that tadpole that help them to resist the salt water later. So it's just kind of like the mom is, well, if like you go to the gym and you get strong every day, you're changing your body so that you get much stronger. It's kind of the same idea. She's having babies in a gym. She's putting them in there early so they can get strong. Don't do that. Okay, for larval development, I have found that these coastal frogs have a much shorter time that they spend as tadpoles. So they will speed up their rates of development. So they get out of there early. So they can get out of there faster, which is good because as summer progresses on the coast and some of the water evaporates, the salt stays. So it actually gets saltier and saltier and saltier as the summer goes on. So it's really good for them to get out quick. Cellular changes. So our bodies are made out of cells. These are like little balloons that hold all these little functional pieces that work as little machines, and they're really, really neat. But we see changes all the way down to inside the cells. So inside the cells, they have proteins, and proteins are what do all the work of the cells. They're like the little busybodies that are doing identifying the cell, cleaning the cell, making sure the cell is reproducing, doing all these things. We see changes within each cell that help it resist salt water. So if anybody has ever sat in the tub too long, what happens to your fingertips? They get wrinkly. This is because water is actually getting into the cells in your fingertips and causing those cells to expand. And because they expand, your fingers get really, really wrinkly. Well, if you have a protein called an aquaporin, which is what is shown down here, this little protein, that is what is in part responsible for letting some of that water in. So these are little water proteins that are on the outside of a cell that let water in and out of a cell. And so changes in the amount of those proteins can change how easily water gets in and out, which is really important if you're in an area where you don't want to lose the fresh water that's inside of you. And more importantly, you don't want to let that salt water in. So we do see changes there. And even in the way they structure their skin. So preliminary work has shown that mucus glands, so coastal frogs may have more mucus glands, which means they can produce more mucus, which acts as a barrier to the outside world and helps protect them against salt water getting into their bodies. So there's a lot of different ways. This work is totally ongoing. I expect there will be a lot more that we find from this, but it's really, really interesting. And the overall lesson, and the lesson that I have learned from these frogs and what frogs have taught me, is that if these green tree frogs can evolve, maybe other species can too. And that really gives me hope, because a lot of times we focus so much on the bad news and the fact that these frogs are in trouble, and they are, that we kind of forget to look at the good that's going on. And so this is a good thing. It is good that they can evolve, and it does give me hope. So lots of work to do, but that's where we are at the moment. And so with that, I know I've been answering some questions as we go, but are there any other questions right now? I'm gonna, oh, there it is, stop share. Okay, very cool, thank you. Emery, your work with oysters is goals for me. How long have you been a doctor about frogs? It's called defended, and that's where you sort of become a doctor. I defended about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago. Time flies, 2 years ago. Yes, they wrinkle. They are wrinkled, aren't they? Did I miss any? I'll scroll up on this questions. Oh, thanks, Blair. Asheville. Let's see. Interesting. I agree.
Well, we are running a little low on time anyways, so if nobody has any extra questions, we will just wrap it up here. We will be posting this video to our YouTube page. Ooh, how do you hug a frog? That one just came in.
So gently. So gently.
But yeah, we will be posting this to our Facebook page, to the Asheville Museum of Science, with all the rest, our website with all the rest of our amazing Ask a Scientist volunteers. Molly, thank you so much. This was a really fabulous presentation, and I'm so grateful for your time this morning. And thank you everyone from this class that tuned in. I hope that you guys enjoyed it, and I hope that this sparked your interest about frogs.
Thanks, Abby.
Yeah, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.